So yeah, it's a hard sell still. I find it quite difficult to sell books. I find it quite difficult to make the argument because a lot of people have a lot of thoughts invested in the idea that invasive species, alien species, are bad. Is there any chance of a little light here, incidentally? I don't know if that's possible. Just a little on here? I hope that doesn't stop that. Yeah, that's better. Thank you. That's the cover of the book in the English version of the book. There's a German version, which is out on the table out there. Why we should love alien species. That's going to be my case. Here is what we are told. We're being told that alien species are taking over nature. Here's an American crayfish invading Europe's rivers. Or the Japanese knotweed. Here's my picture of Japanese knotweed. You can see it does take over gardens and stray patches. That's in Swansea in Wales. So yeah, sure, they're pretty invasive. That guy there is the Swansea Japanese knotweed officer. So far as I know, he's the world's only officer in charge of getting rid of Japanese knotweed. As you can see, he's not doing very well. Or European rats and cats, like this one in the Indian Ocean, running around eating the bird life of remote islands. Birds like this one in Gough Island in the South Atlantic, which rather stupidly nests on the ground, which is not a brilliant idea when there are rats around. So it's scary. You just heard some of the stories, and some of them are true. Many of them are true. Our modern world of globalized trade is giving alien species more and more chances to travel round the planet, set up home in foreign lands. They're hitchhiking in our hand luggage, they're hiding in cargo holds, they're being discharged from ships' ballast tanks. They have many ways of getting around the world. Conservationists believe that these biological adventurers, I have a more sort of positive language for them, you'll hear. Biological adventurers, they see them as a cancer on native ecosystems, and they want to stop the invasion. You see signs like that all over in the States. So American rivergoers are on permanent alert for zebra mussels, for instance, or Australian highway patrols check under cars with mirrors for stowaway South American cane toads. Now, as an environmental journalist, I'm a British journalist, written about environmental issues for 30 years or so. And I've written a lot of stories reporting warnings about the havoc that these species can cause and the need to root them out and so on. But I've always been a bit disturbed by the idea that conservationists should be going around killing the bits of nature that we don't like. It kind of feels a bit wrong that conservationists should be doing that. Now, we humans, I agree, sometimes have reasons for getting rid of troublesome invaders. There are plant diseases. There are things that invade our gardens, like the Japanese knotweed is the best example. And we have a right to do that when they're causing trouble to us, economic trouble, or maybe even if we just don't like the species involved. But I wonder whether we should be doing that in the name of nature conservation. It feels like a kind of ecological cleansing, a sort of green xenophobia, or to keep the migrants out, whether they're species or humans. And I instinctively don't like that. Maybe there is something to be admired in nature's colonists, nature's go-getters, nature's adventurers. An influx of migrant humans can often, after all, be the best way of reviving a run-down part of a city. So maybe migrant species, maybe just what is needed to kickstart a revival of nature in the 21st century, a revival in the face of all the damage that we've done to ecosystems. That's You know, I wonder. Begin to think that that's true. Is it part of nature's fight back against the damage that we've done to the planet? Part of maybe creating new wildernesses. If we want to rewild the planet, maybe these are the species that are going to help us do it. But first I want to look at why we get a bit crazy, I think, about alien species. Now, take the story of the ruddy duck. Looks pretty inoffensive. It's a native of North America, and it was brought to Europe by a British naturalist called Sir Peter Scott, who put it on his English bird reserve. Some of them escaped, unsurprisingly, I guess, and they began breeding. And soon some of them flew south, and they reached as far as Spain. And there, the local females of the locally endangered Spanish white-headed duck, well, the females rather liked the big new Americans that had just shown up, and they hooked up, and they produced some hybrid ducks. Spanish ornithologists were appalled. They spent years trying to revive the local populations of the white-headed duck and to defend its genetic purity, as they saw it. So they demanded a cull of all these American ruddy ducks coming across Europe. And they got their way. There's been a European program to get rid of the ruddy duck. And last summer, in England, marksmen were roaming around the countryside, shooting the very last of them. There are about 12 left. I've not checked if they've got the last one. Maybe they don't know. But the cost was about €3,000 per bird to shoot the last ones. But why? The ruddy ducks do no obvious harm. It's far from clear how many hybrids have actually been produced. And anyhow, crossbreeding among waterfowl like these is normal. Genetic purity is a bit of a myth when you're talking about wildfowl. So if the Spanish duck senoritas want to make out with their American cousins, then I say, why not? I don't think nature loses by it. And shooting the American birds out of the sky seems a very odd thing to me for conservationists to be doing. So I wonder why we seem so often to fear them. You probably can't quite see that. That's it's a piece of work by a British graffiti artist, Banksy. And he's satirising our nasty dislike of foreigners by suggesting, satirising the creation of our reaction to newly arrived parakeets in London. Some people hate them, some people love them. But ecologists say, no, it's not about how we just hate foreigners. That's a libel on them. There is actually a more respectable reason, a more ecological reason for disliking alien species. They say that alien species are intrinsically bad for ecosystems. They see ecosystems, if I can summarize it, as kind of perfected biological machines where every species has a place. Every species has evolved into that place. So outsiders, if you believe that idea of what ecosystems are like, can only be trouble. You know, they're invaders. They don't fit in. They can't fit in. They didn't evolve in that environment. And that idea of ecosystems has taken hold as a kind of endpoint of evolution, I suppose you'd say. Owes a lot to this guy, George Perkins Marsh, who was America's first conservationist. 150 years ago, he wrote that. Nature, left undisturbed, he said, so fashions her territory as to give it almost unchanging permanence of form, outline, and proportion. In other words, nature kind of reaches a peak. It produces brilliant ecosystems, the rainforests or whatever, and those are unimprovable, and they're unchanging. And in the 20th century, this idea of pristine and perfect nature took hold. Conservationists have seen their job often as defending it against any kind of threat, especially perhaps the arrival of alien species who might disrupt these perfect ecosystems. But there's another view. This is a guy called Botkin, an American American conservationist and ecologist, who says that the trouble is, nature isn't like that. The more we learn, the less it looks as if nature works to perfection. It turns out that ecosystems change all the time, quite naturally, with species constantly coming and going. And Daniel Botkin here said, wherever we seek to find constancy, we discover change. Nature, undisturbed, is not constant. It changes at every scale of time and space. It's a very different picture of nature, not something that's perfected and reaches its peak, but it's something constantly evolving and changing. And that means there's nothing intrinsically bad about alien species. Migrants are normal in that picture of nature. And so perhaps we should just judge them on their merits and not assume that outsiders are bad. So, what are the merits of aliens? Most ecologists think they don't have any benefits at all, really. They say they cause mass extinctions among natives, they're very invasive, they take over ecosystems, they reduce biodiversity, as often said. But there are very few actual records of real species extinctions when aliens move in. I explored this in some detail for the book because I heard the stories so many times. Usually it's a case of more species the merrier. So Britain, for instance, has some 2,300 species that are not conventionally regarded as native. Of course, it depends how far you go back. I mean, if you go back 10,000 years, Britain was covered in ice, so everything is kind of new. But even if you go back a few hundred years, 2,300 alien species in Britain, and yet none, so far as we know, has caused any local extinctions. They've actually added to biodiversity, added to the potential, I would say, for future evolution, for future adaptation to things like climate change. And it's happening now. People are documenting that process going on. North America, pretty similarly. It got invaded by lots and lots of European species after Europeans first arrived there 500 years ago, and it's easy to plot their invasion. People produce maps like that. That's a bit schematic, but you get the idea. There's this kind of disease of alien species heading across America. But the facts are these. The arrival of some 4,000 plant species from Europe that is known about there has added a fifth to America's biodiversity. And so far as anybody knows, you can't prove it, but there's only one known extinction of a native plant species as a result. The numbers of some have gone down, but actual extinctions, really very rare. Now these statistics are hard to square with all constant claims about extinction threats from aliens. So I checked out the sources of some of these extinction claims. There are a number of them that are repeatedly made. And I found the results, well, shocking, really. You probably can't quite read that, but it's taken from the website of Britain's Non-Native Species Secretariat, in charge of alien species. It's a government agency. And it says that aliens have, quote, contributed to 40% of the animal extinctions in the last 400 years. It's a global figure. The European Environment Agency says much the same thing. And both agencies, in turn, cite UN bodies' reports. So I went back to the UN reports, and the UN reports cite other papers, and you go back and back and back. Well, it's not too many links, but you get back actually to one source, literally one source. A paper by a Princeton ecologist called David Wilkove, and here's the paper. Now, as you can see from the title, Wilkove was not actually talking about real extinctions. He was talking about extinction threats, which is different from what all the agencies reporting was saying. He's talking about threats, not real extinctions. So that's different and quite subjective, whatever the threat is. But he also wasn't writing about the world as a whole, but only the US. Another difference from what the UN agencies tell us. And in fact, 40% of his figure, he says, is a result of data from Hawaii. a group of Pacific islands with a very, very particular evolutionary history that I won't go into. No way is Hawaii typical of the US, let alone the world. And when I asked Wilco about how his paper was being used, he agreed it was being badly misused. So probably the most widely quoted statistic on how aliens cause mass extinctions turns out to be a made-up figure, basically, or a complete, statistical garbage. Scandalously sloppy science, to be honest. I'm a science reporter. I know what sloppy science looks like, and this is it. But it seems to fit what most people want to hear, and so it kind of gets believed. So there's a sort of theoretical background, and this sort of intellectual sloppiness, I think, in all the arguments about alien species. But let's go back to real species. Perhaps we can trust them a bit more. This is back to this American crayfish. Sometimes we just don't like what shows up on our shores. It's big and it's nasty and it's horrible. And in Britain, my home country, we seem to have a particular dislike of American species. Whether the crayfish here or grey squirrels, which have been pushing out our red squirrels, and that's certainly true, they have been, or American mink, that we blamed for a long time for the disappearance of our otters. But now the otters are making a comeback, and the mink is still there, so it looks like mink were innocent all along. And that meant that conservationists went off on a wrong track, thinking they could save otters by getting rid of mink. Actually, it looks like otters were probably killed by pesticides. And now we've reduced the pesticides, the otters are coming back. So the mink took advantage of the absence of otters, I'm sure, for hunting along riverbanks. But it wasn't to blame. Maybe mink will one day be regarded more kindly in the US, in the UK. And that often happens to aliens, actually. We hate them when they first arrive, but after a while they kind of settle in and they become honorary natives, you might say. That certainly happened in Britain with the rabbit. And most Britons love rabbits. They breed, as you can see, like rabbits, we say. Many have no idea that they're not native. In fact, they were brought to Britain from Spain about 1,000 years ago to be farmed for their meat and for their fur. And later, when we didn't want that anymore, we released them and they spread across the countryside, and they're now out there in their millions. And now, in theory, I suppose, if we were following the letter of the law, we should be slaughtering them all as dangerous invasive species. But we don't, because we quite like them. So another thing to say is that we're quite, sometimes we like species and sometimes we don't, and we get rid of the ones we don't like. We're entitled to do that, but I don't think, we're not helping nature particularly by that. And I think actually we should like a lot more alien species than we do. Currently they're the exception, but okay, now here's a hard case. Successful aliens often move into places damaged by humans. This is not a universal rule, but it's very often true. Very often, I think, they revive them. We should be encouraging them. They're doing good. They're putting right the damage that humans have done through pollution or whatever. And these are zebra mussels in the North American lakes. And they arrived in Lake Erie in ballast water from Russia about half a century or so ago. And they're now there in their trillions, literally, as you can see here on a beach in Lake Erie. The Americans, well, they're America's most hated alien species, I think you'd say. But they hardly invaded a pristine ecosystem. Before they showed up, Lake Erie was one of the most polluted places on the planet. It was almost dead. The surface used to catch fire from time to time. And that pollution is why the zebra mussel, all the way from Russia, did so well. Because unlike native species, it enjoyed all the pollution. It's what biologists would call a filter feeder. It sucks in all the gunk, and it's very good at it. And it's set about cleansing the lake's murky waters, which are now much clearer today, partly because pollution's gone down, I agree, but partly because of the zebra mussels, just cleaning it out. Now, yes, they do damage, and people talk about this a lot, to water intake pipes and jetties, and they just sort of cling onto them. But now light can penetrate much further down into the lake, to the lake bottom. It's cleaned up the waters, and the plants on the lake bed are reviving as a result of the zebra mussels. Many fish, including the previously endangered lake sturgeon, have done very well by eating the zebra mussels. So I don't hear environmentalists sort of say much about that. They're still the evil species. But if you look at the whole ecosystem, they've actually been quite good for it, I would argue. So successful alien species are kind of proven colonists. They're survivors. They could go into places and do things that the natives often can't. And that's why they thrive, in some cases, when they can do that. Often nature is recovering from damage caused by humans, thanks to aliens. And there are lots of examples of this. Take the US-run island of Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. It was in the news in the last few days because of the hurricanes. Now, over the centuries, farmers there had trashed the once forested island. They turned much of it into more or less desert. A few decades ago, the farmers began abandoning the farmland because it was no good anymore, really. It was eroded, it was sun-baked, it was increasingly infertile. So the question when the farmers had gone was, would nature come back? Now, the surviving native Caribbean trees up in the mountains found it hard to come down into the fields. They didn't make much progress. But luckily, in the centuries that they'd been there, the European humans had stocked their gardens in Puerto Rico with lots of alien species, like the African tulip tree. That's a picture of it there. And these aliens were much good at reinvading. They took their chance. And they've been colonizing the abandoned fields, reviving the soils to the point where the natives are now starting to come back. And their seeds were spread by both native and alien birds nesting in the alien trees. And now there's a rich mix of alien and native species recolonizing the planet. But it's the aliens that got it going. Without them, the place would still be largely barren. So that's a lesson. We can have these mixtures of alien and native species really doing quite good things. And the aliens are often doing the things that the natives couldn't manage themselves. Lots of places are kind of successful mixers of native and alien. I visited San Francisco Bay here. Now, since the gold rush in the 1850s, there's been a biological rush of species stuck to ships' hulls and stuck to oil rigs and carried in ballast water, hidden in cargo unloaded at the ports. That's kind of moved into the bay. So the bay has amur clams from Russia. It has Atlantic green crabs. It has Black Sea jellyfish. It has Chinese mitten crabs. It has Japanese gobies. It has a sea slug all the way from New Zealand. Now, you might say this is dreadful. The conservationists have asked for them all to be exterminated. Difficult task, but they wanted it done. They wanted to recreate what they sometimes call a pristine ecosystem of native species in the bay. But the truth actually is that the bay never had a fixed set of species. It changes too much. It's a bay. Sometimes it's quite fresh water, sometimes it's much saltier. It changes with the seasons, but also big spring floods that occasionally come down the rivers into the bay and flush out the salt water, and you get a kind of reboot of the whole ecosystem every few years when that happens. So change is normal in San Francisco Bay. There isn't an established set of species that are always there. And that is why, perhaps, despite the new aliens, the bay is in such good health. This is how it normally is, stuff coming in, stuff going out. In 2013, the International Ramsar Convention on Wetlands declared that San Francisco Bay was, quote, of international importance, a natural wonder, and a critical ecological resource. I guess the aliens must have been doing something right there. So let's also celebrate what happened on Ascension Island. This is an island, a volcanic hulk, way out in the South Atlantic, hundreds of kilometers from anywhere. Virtually nothing grew there. Charles Darwin, on one of his great voyages, dropped by, and he condemned it for its naked hideousness. He couldn't find any evolution to investigate, so he moved on. After that, British sailors tried to improve things. on their way backwards and forwards to various bits of the British Empire, they began planting trees on Ascension Island, brought from Australia, from South Africa, from the Caribbean. They weren't thinking about whether they were putting together an ecosystem, they just wanted to plant some stuff, make it look a bit greener. And the trees did very well. They climbed up the island's bare central mountain. As I say, it was bare, but it's now called Green Mountain, because it's covered in trees. And today, insects also have come from all across the world, flit around between the trees and seem to have some kind of ecosystem going for them. They know they eat and reproduce and seem to pollinate the trees and so on. It's a brand new ecosystem made up out of effectively random species. This is not kind of how evolution of ecosystems is supposed to happen. It's really very different. Every one of those species is alien. And I've spent some time with a local conservation officer, there he is, Stetson Stroud, who's amazed that ecologists from around the world don't come to research this place. It seems, really unusual, really interesting. A test case for novel ecosystems, you might say. But instead, the British government's official conservation policy is to exterminate the aliens, to let native species prosper. That's what it says in the plan. Now that policy is pretty crazy. The only natives, well, there are a few, but they're all ferns, or almost all ferns, and they now live exclusively on the branches of the alien trees. There they are. Take away the trees and the ferns might now disappear too. My guess is that the largest native animal, the endemic local land crab there, which once ate turtle eggs, but now feasts mostly on alien fruits like guava, would go hungry too. Am I running out of time?
Surely, yes.
Okay, all right. I'll rush through a little bit. Now, I don't say that everything always goes perfectly well when unexpected species show up. There are some horror stories like this is a mouse on Gough Island in the South Pacific that mutated to double its normal size and became a carnivore, and is now eating its way through one of the world's most important seabed colonies. So I can see that, but many eradications I think are unnecessary, and even major infestations fizzle out after a few years. Let me just give you the example of the muskrat. The American muskrat was once the alien plague of Europe. It arrived in Europe courtesy of Joseph II, I think, a prince near Prague in 1905. He went on a hunting expedition in Alaska and brought 5 of them back. And he released them into the estate, and a few escaped. Before long, they were spreading all over large areas of Europe. There's a huge hue and cry about it. This is from the New York Times. American muskrats plagued Bohemia, and it went beyond Bohemia. Like the rabbit in Australia and the English sparrow in Australia, the muskrat has developed a long list of evil traits, scoffing river crabs, undermining riverbanks, and so on. And many governments, including the Austrian government, set up eradication programs. They all failed, and the animal continued to spread. You'll now find it as far as Japan and the Russian Far East, the north of Scandinavia, the western shores of France. It's got pretty much everywhere. But the expected ecological disaster never happened. Because as what often happens with these kind of invasions, the numbers kind of grew a lot and they peaked and then they declined. The animals sort of settled in. So muskrats have turned out not to be so much trouble after all. And they've added to local biodiversity, you might say, one more species. In a study in 2012 by the European Environment Agency, they were ignored altogether, apart from a passing reference, because they were eating the invasive zebra mussels. I don't know what you make of that, but anyway, a century on, the muskrat is almost at home. If I can just give one more example before we finish. 20 years ago, there was a panic on the French Riviera about an Indian Ocean algae called caulerpa that began spreading along the shore. It had been accidentally introduced into the sea from an aquarium in Jacques Cousteau's Oceanographic Museum. And it spread across the Mediterranean, went down to the southern shore, it started going east, and it was headline news. I read some articles about it. But soon after, it did spread a long way, I agree. But then boom turned to bust, and soon after the algae, in fact ever since the algae has been in retreat, and it's now largely gone. Nobody kind of talks about that. We have the great fun of the scandal of how it's spreading everywhere, but we kind of ignore the fact that it's gone away again. I found a list of the top 10 most worst invasive weeds published in the 1970s. Out of those 10, only 2 of them now even make the top 100. Kogan grass and water hyacinth, if you want to know which ones. The rest are largely forgotten. We should remember that. Mostly nature recovers or indeed prospers as a result of the species that we get so fussed about. So I'll go through those. No, let's give you Angkor Wat. That's just trees invading the Angkor Wat in Cambodia. To sum up, I think conservationists have got nature really wrong. They often like to think of ecosystems as pristine and perfected places where every species has evolved with a specific purpose. And this system is fragile and has to be protected. Any outside influence could destroy it. But the new ecology suggests a rather different vision of nature, which is much more random, more transient, more accidental, but also more resilient, constantly evolving, constantly adapting to whatever comes in. In the new wild, aliens, like nature's desperados, nature's stowaways, its rebels, are a vital part of nature's survival strategy. Now they can, as I say, sometimes create problems, usually for us rather than anything else, and we're perfectly entitled in the Anthropocene to want to fix any problems that they deliver. I'm not saying we should leave all alien species to do anything they want. But we should remember that's about us and our convenience rather than how nature works. Nature works in a different way. And often these alien species, they bring new skills to recover from the effects of our chainsaws and our plows and our pollution. Migration of species is going to be the way that nature copes with climate change. Species are going to have to move around to kind of keep up with the changing climate zones. We need to recognize that as well. So to rewild the planet, to cope with climate change, I think we need to reboot our ideas about conservation to help these go-getters. Conservationists should stop spending so much time trying to protect the unchanging permanence that the American environmentalists mentioned 150 years ago. There is no unchanging permanence. We must start promoting nature wherever and however it really is. And that means sometimes cheering on these colonists, not hunting them down, saying these are part of nature's regeneration. They're nature's winners. We should support them sometimes. They're the future. So, long live the new wild, and thank you very much.